welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and today, zooming in from India, an author who wrote a really interesting book, The Phantom Plague, How Tuberculosis Shaped History.
Hi, thank you for having me over. It's such a pleasure to be here. The book is about tuberculosis, but it's also tuberculosis is an excuse. It's also about people in general. What I've tried to do in the book is see how science and social science waltz together. And if anything, the last 3 years have taught us that it's actually not science, but social science that exerts influence on outcomes of plagues. And that's kind of what this book does. I have used a lot of pop culture because TB is also vast, and it gives so much scope to a writer to go in whichever direction in history. So I have made use of all of that bit that this provided me, and I would love to hear what you make of it.
We're trying really hard. We try to focus on a variety of things on Turn the Page, and we're trying to sort of open up a little bit more nonfiction, and especially things about the medical field, and books about the history of diseases, because it's really important. And like you said, if the last 2 years have shown us anything, it is really important to kind of see how these things have unfolded in the past, to kind of get an idea of how they work socially. And I was, first of all, absolutely floored and at the same time amused that the story, or the book rather, it opened up talking about vampires.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about why this is important to talk about if you're going to talk about tuberculosis?
So again, I am Indian, and I have grown up on stories. So Eastern storytelling is. I grew up on Salman Rushdie and authors who look at stories as Russian dolls. So there are stories within stories within stories, and I kind of grew up on that kind of storytelling. And when I started writing this book, it's just for us to understand what a pathogen does, what science does, we have to be told the story in a way that you can grasp it in all its contours. And I genuinely wanted to start with the history, because diseases, like people, have an ancestry, and if we are to control these pathogens, we need to know how we got to where we are, and then take remedial measures. So one of the reasons I start with Dracula, which first of all, it's super fun, but secondly, it's also an era of magical thinking that we are in. We are also in a era where no one believes in science, and I kind of wanted to mirror that at a time when actually we were before science. There were no microscopes, and what did unscientific thinking do to societies? And of course, Dracula is such a brilliant book to do that with, and it was my jackpot to start the book with that, because it's just such a fascinating way to reinterpret Dracula, because so many times Dracula has been reinterpreted as something to do with sexual revolution in the Victorian era. But I just love going around claiming it's actually a book about public health and infectious diseases. And it's really fun to kind of provoke an audience, provoke them to think about Dracula in a new way. And I hope I do that in the book.
Well, you do. And some of the things you touch upon with it. So first of all, just for people who are listening, the book opens talking about people who are now, tuberculosis used to be known as consumption, who are suffering, and somebody digs up the grave of their daughter who's been dead for a while because what is it? The superstition says something about if her heart is a certain way, that means she's kind of feeding off of her family members.
Yeah, again, this is an era before medicine, and what people thought was that people were because everyone showed the same symptoms before they died, because it was infectious disease and it was spreading. And how the human mind could comprehend it, the thing is, what we don't understand we fear, and what we fear manifests in what in medical annals is known as the vampire panic. And how villagers interpreted that, because everyone was showing the same symptoms and dying, was that people who died like that were crawling out of their graves at night and sucking the blood of their loved ones.
Obviously, right?
Obviously.
I mean, obviously, what else could it be?
Of course. And the only antidote for it was to dig up the grave, exhume the person. And if you saw that their heart or liver, their offal, they still had blood, it meant that what they thought was true. But the thing is, in a frigid winter, the bodies decompose very slowly. So again, this was an era before science, and it's so fascinating to look at how the human mind looks at scary things and what it makes of it. And I'm really hoping that's kind of the thought, because the book also ends in an era like US. In India, we are also in an era of anti-vaccination and questioning science, and we've been here and we're making the same mistakes again. So it's time to go back to history to learn our lessons.
So a few things that sort of came up. So you talk a little bit about how tuberculosis was considered at one point was consumption, and in Victorian literature, if you hear she died of the consumption, it was, and you say this in the book as well, considered a romantic disease, which is wild. Wild.
Yeah. It's actually not very wild if you look at the other big killer of that era, which was cholera, which means you shit yourself to death.
Yeah,
So,
I guess that's less romantic.
Yeah, it also killed a lot of the idea of beauty that we have, like gaunt-looking women, comes from protagonists in novels, and all these operatic tragedies where women were dying of tuberculosis left, right, and center, and it killed a lot of and writers and artists. And there's a paragraph I use from Dombey and Sons, where tuberculosis is almost written off as a disease that purified the person who was dying. And it's such a fascinating way it's a terrible killer. It's an excruciating disease which kills mercilessly. And when we did not have drugs to cure it or vaccines to stop this is how you interpreted it, and it's just fascinating.
So a few other things that are kind of mentioned, and then I want to get into what's going on currently, and also just a little bit about, you talk about the antibiotics and about the strains of tuberculosis right now. I thought it was, again, like you kind of go through this history of how, first of all, germ theory and hand washing became a big thing, like just how surgeons performed with these dirty conditions. And it was considered like almost like a mark of honor if your surgeon's apron had so much blood on it that it stood up on its own. And hand washing was like, what are you talking about? Like washing hands? Like why should we do that before we open up another human and put our ungloved hands into their internal organs? As well as how tuberculosis kind of shaped like fashion, like everything from beards to the fact that skirts were scandalizing because they were now lifting closer to the ankles.
Yeah. Again, it's such a beautiful way to see how pathogens impact us the same way we impact it. It's a waltz, and to find these about doctors who were mostly men in that era, and again very resistant to new evidence, which is again all things that we are seeing now, where I write about germ theory in a chapter about Ignaz Semmelweis, who is a tragic hero who keeps saying that there is evidence and we should wash our hands. But doctors and gentlemen who did not like being accused of having dirty hands, which is what was killing all these women who were delivering babies. And it's really fascinating, and it's about gender as well, because
Yeah.
men eventually said, we are not going to stop spitting, but it's the woman's responsibility to clean, and their trailing long Victorian skirts take the germs inside the house, so why don't they wear shorter skirts? And women at that point were already fed up of tight corsets and these long skirts.
Right.
And as always, women are more pliable to change. So the hemlines went up and shoes became fashionable. And there was a ripple effect of TB control.
But like when you talk about even like the hand washing, it's just so crazy that is so controversial to people, that washing your hands, but then at the same time, it's really not, because then when you see today, like that whole attitude of like, yeah, well, I don't want to say you can't make me, but like I'm not going to do this thing that could really help people in the long run. I guess not. And I think maybe part of it is because we've had so many years of washing hands being the polite thing to do, that maybe it's just ingrained in our mind. And that doesn't seem so crazy, but who knows? I mean, I remember the first time I heard that hand washing was considered controversial and people couldn't understand, and especially, women dying in childbirth, that people couldn't understand why they were dying, and then also why people were saying maybe if you wash your hands, they wouldn't. And I also thought that one thing that was interesting was how language kind of affected the whole thing. When you talk about spitting, that spitting was considered expectorating. And by the way, Charles Dickens, who came to America and thought like we were so gross because all we did was spit, that was an interesting quote as well, to think about. But changing the language from don't expectorate to don't spit, I guess, because the way that it sounded, it almost changed the whole view on what was happening.
It's again, words build worlds. And about the Charles Dickens coming to Boston, if I'm not wrong, and calling America a moist nation of spitters, was not meant to cause offense. It was just so fascinating for me, because where the US was 200 years ago is where India is now. And people spit. It's not just India. I report in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. So it's such a fascinating mirror to look at this as a single global story, as against deal with it. What we do with the pandemic as well, it's not a pandemic in one country, it's a global issue. And unless we all, so that was my reason to bring that in. And frankly, I am more forgiving of people 200 years ago who were spitting or who were refusing to wash hands, because the prevalent science of the time was that diseases spread because of foul smells, the miasmatic theory, which was replaced by the germ theory. And germ theory has been in place for centuries now, and we still have such a tough time convincing people of hand hygiene or not spitting, wearing face masks, all of these struggles. I do believe that in trying to go back to 200 years and looking at how societies before medicine dealt with it, we would walk away with some lessons without antagonizing each other or blaming governments. Or I hope that comes out of it, but it's also a good story.
So this brings us to the next part, and you opened the door beautifully for it. So you move the story from the States and Victorian era to modern times in India. And first of all, the class differences in India, as well as the spread of disease, and how tuberculosis, while here, we've considered it eradicated, considered it, whether that's not necessarily true, is very different over there. And there's different types of tuberculosis that are resistant to treatments.
Yeah, so there are three myths about TB: that it affects the poor, it affects only lungs, and it's curable. And at this time, all three are entirely wrong. It does not just affect the poor; it affects the poor disproportionately, but it affects everyone. It's not. Exactly like cancer. I have met people while reporting this book with TB in their eye, in their brain, in their spine, intestine, and increasingly, so it's not a disease of one organ, which is lungs, and increasingly it's not curable because we have used antibiotics to a point that we have more and more drug resistance, and it has made tuberculosis an even more dangerous enemy than it has always been. And caste and class differences in the US, we see different health deficits in different races. So communities that live in housing projects, or African American communities, or refugees and migrants, have higher incidence of infectious diseases. And in India, the framework, the structure of discrimination is not race, because we are all the same color. So we just came up with a new way of discriminating, and it's caste. So lower caste communities in India are disproportionately ghettoized. They live in poorer neighborhoods where they then do not have municipality and garbage and all of those sanitation services that feed into the spread of infectious diseases. And that's kind of, again, it's such a beautiful parallel. It's such a beautiful contrast that was just lying there to be made. And I feel like it was my privilege to document this parallel between US and India, and in these terms.
Yeah, it really was. And it's you talk about, so you talk about Mumbai, and you talk about just like how big it really is, and how many people live there, but also how drastic the difference between class is. You talk about something called the trigger photo. Could you tell us about that a bit?
So the trigger photo is from this group of doctors and the architects, and this one project that was done in one of the densest slum clusters in Mumbai. And it's so this building where the poor people were just ghettoized, because Mumbai is India's financial engine. So we had a lot of migrants coming in from different parts of the country there, and they were all boxed in to the corner, not very different from how 7-cent housing in New York used to be hundreds of years ago. And what then happened is, at the center of this dense cluster of buildings, there are the lower floors which don't receive sunlight, and there is no ventilation, despite this being on the shoreline of the Arabian Sea. Look how thick this cluster of building then has to be. So you open your window and you're just in spitting distance of someone else staring into your house. And and then there is no ventilation, and there's no sunlight. And in one particular building, there were 51 cases of drug-resistant tuberculosis. And this is as rare as finding 51 cases of a rare cancer in one building. And what's happened now is because our urban housing policy was just so inhumane to the poor people who live in our mega cities, we made these dense clusters of buildings a petri dish for the pathogen to just, it's a springboard. So in India, Mumbai has the highest incidence of TB, but within Mumbai, this particular colony is the hottest, it's the eye of the storm. So in the global battle of TB, this particular neighborhood in Mumbai is the hottest of hotspots. Um, and a photo, so the doctors basically pulled out this one building's photo, and they numbered, they pulled arrows next to each house, and they were just shocked by how many people in just one building had this. And it launched a project, and I go into this book in greater detail about what that project is about and how we can make housing for poor a little bit more humane, because unless we address that, we are not going to address this crisis of infectious disease that is essentially a global problem. It may be in Mumbai, but as coronavirus has shown, infectious diseases do not respect geographical boundaries. And that's kind of what I was trying to capture there.
This book was really, really good, and I do hope that listeners are compelled to pick it up, because it's just written in a way that is digestible and keeps the information very interesting and urgent, and really just in sort of opens eyes. I mean, I certainly hope it does. Before we sign off, was there something that kind of really just jumped out at you that you learned while researching for the book?
You know, what you read in those pages is the only way I could explain the story to myself. And I will say, for all its flaws, India is a post-national democracy, and I have grown up believing in that democratic structure. So the central reason for me writing that book was watching the teenager who moved courts to access treatment for drug-resistant TB.
Yes, this was such a compelling part of the book.
I was very shocked that our government kept denying this girl a medicine that was available. And frankly, that particular chapter, that's chapter 7 of the book, everything else that I do in the book is to be able to tell this teenager's story. And I will never be able to reconcile with the fact that we live in a civilized society, and India calls itself a democracy, and we just killed a teenage girl for no reason, and somehow the government justified it. And that will remain with me for a very long time. Her family was destroyed in the process. And again, we are seeing all of this happen now because so many Black and brown nations do not have access to coronavirus vaccines. It is now a preventable disease. And what I wrote about it in the Atlantic, what I call this is moral malnutrition. We have the means, we have all the miracles of modern medicine. We are just greedy and we refuse to share. And I really hope anyone who takes that message from the book, it is that it's not about whether pathogens will succeed. It's about basic human decency. Will we succeed in being decent human beings? And that's kind of what stays with me from this book.
Thank you so much for this. The Phantom Plague is available in libraries and bookstores everywhere. And it is a very compelling read. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me over, and thank you for being such a generous reader. I appreciate.
This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest was
Vidya Krishnan.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.